We're going to have hopefully a little bit more time for questions after this panel, and Steve can join us for that. We're also having after this as one of the breakout sessions a regulatory updates panel, and Steve's not going to present in that, but he is going to be available in case any of us screw up or if we have questions. So there will be more time for questions because I know you guys always have questions for Steve. What will the direct shipping channel look like in 20 years? How will the American regulatory environment develop over the coming 2 decades? Are consumers moving in a direction that will force marketers to rethink how they reach them? Will the 3-tier distribution system be around for another 75 years? Contemplating these kinds of questions, and just as important, providing rational answers requires experience and vision. Today, we will be providing you with access to the ideas and thoughts of 4 true industry visionaries who will provide you with their most succinct visions for what is coming to the wine industry over the next 10 to 20 years. It's a practice of looking forward with purpose, something we try to do regularly as ShipCompliant. However, we rarely have with us 4 people like today's visionaries to help us think in a forward fashion. Today, we have them. I want to introduce 4 speakers who will each speak to you for about 5 to 6 minutes, giving you their most succinct and well-developed predictions for the future of the wine industry over the next 10 to 20 years. Pay attention, write down your questions. Our visionaries will move quickly through their short presentations before we open up for questions. At this time, I'd like to invite our panelists up to the stage, and I'll introduce them. No, I don't think it matters. I think I'll introduce all 4 in order, and then step down and let them go at their own pace. Rowan Gormley, green shirt, is one of the wine industry's genuine innovators. The founder of Naked Wines, the only wine retailer in the world that invests in its winemakers. And through this unique model, he has attracted more than 100,000 new wine customers throughout Europe in a 2-year period. Naked Wines, along with its unique wine business model, has recently expanded into the United States. So we expect to hear a great deal more from Rowan. We are very excited to hear from him today on the issues of direct-to-consumer wine sales. Rob Tobiasen, down on the end. Very few people have had the kind of important effect on the overall wine industry than Rob Tobiasen. And no one in Washington, D.C. has had as much effect on the wine industry as he. For 9 years, Rob was the chief counsel for TTB. From that position, Rob oversaw all the legal aspects of federal alcohol regulations, including taxation, regulatory and administrative matters, globalization, international trade, and appropriations. Add to this his oversight of federal alcohol concerns with constitutional law, trial and appellate litigation, personal and equal opportunity legal issues, ethics, environmental law, and fiscal law. Rob Tobiasen is an unequaled expert in the realm of federal alcohol law and regulations. We're very lucky to have him all the way from DC in his newly retired capacity to speak with us on the future of alcohol regulations. Christian Miller is approaching his 30th year in the wine industry. In that time, he has worked in nearly every aspect of the business. Today, he is his head of research for wine opinions and the proprietor of Full Glass Research, 2 positions from which Christian derives a very unique, comprehensive, and authoritative view of the wine consumer and wine sales. Through his various research projects, Christian provides critical insights into how, why, when, and where consumers buy wine. His perspective and his analytical talents make him one of the wine industry's real visionaries when it comes to the American wine consumer. John Baudet, right next to me. In the area of wine distribution, importation, and logistics, John Baudet is among the industry's true experts. Since 1995, Mr. Baudet has been president and CEO of MHW Limited, a national beverage alcohol import, distribution, and service company that provides U.S. import and distribution services to wineries, breweries, and distilleries throughout the world. He possesses not merely an experienced perspective on the state of wine distribution in America, but also a vivid outlook on the future of this critical sector of the wine industry. We're very pleased to introduce him and to hear his vision for the future of distribution. So we're going to go in order here. Rowan, Rob, Christian, John, as I introduce them. 5 to 6 minutes each. Please hold your questions, write them down, and then we'll do Q&A at the end. Rowan. And each of you can feel free to stay at your seat, come up, whatever's more comfortable. Please help me welcome my panelists.
I think I ought to start my predictions with a health warning, which is we've got an experience of 10 days in the US wine industry. So you probably want to write these predictions down, because when they turn out to be gloriously wrong, you can have a really good laugh at my expense. 3 headlines for direct-to-consumer. The first is, I predict that over the next 20 years, in real terms, prices will collapse in direct-to-consumer. They will fall from $36, $37 a bottle to something closer to $20 a bottle. The second headline, is that volumes will explode by a factor of 3 or 4 times. And the third is that imports will come to make up a much larger share of the DTC market than they do today, maybe even overtaking domestic production. So that's 3. I'm going to make a 4th one, free bonus prediction, which is that Jason Eckenroth is going to be an enormously wealthy man. So what are the trends underlying this? Why do I think these things are going to happen? And the first is the baby boomers dominate the DTC market today. And over the next 20 years, they're going to be replaced by Generation X. And aside from the fact that Generation X are different people, one of the characteristics of Generation X that makes them different to the baby boomers is there's much less respect for authority, much more cynicism, much more belief in what you and your friends think than what institutions tell you to think. So our view is that whereas today the baby boomers are guided very heavily by opinion formers, Robert Parker, Wine Spectator, the like, the Generation Xers are much more likely to be guided by their own taste buds and what their friends think. And that's going to make them adventurous. They're going to try new stuff. The other factor is that demand is growing at 8% and production is growing at 1%. And because of that, imports have got to form a bigger part of the overall US market. And right now, as a simple rule of thumb, the relationship between the cost of the grapes in a bottle of wine and the selling price of that wine, in the DTC market today, it's about 10 to 1. Only about 10 cents of every dollar you're paying for your wine is grapes. In Europe, it's about 3 to 1. So in the US, wine is priced like a luxury good. In most of the rest of the world, wine is priced like a fast-moving consumer good. It's relative to the cost of production. And it seems inevitable that when consumers taste wines that cost $10, they taste very similar to wines that cost 60. Eventually, they're going to go, you know what? I'm going to spend 10. And that'll be a big change. So my prediction, the overall prediction as to what's going to happen, is that right now consumers believe you get what you pay for. And in the future, you will get what you pay for. Thank you.
Is this on? Can you? Great. I have to give my formal disclosure. I am not associated with the U.S. government in any fashion any more than a meager government pensioner. So the views you hear from me are solely those of my own. And after 34 years with the government, it's kind of nice to have those shackles off and be able to talk. This is a challenging topic, and I want to try to help put it briefly in context. If I told you today that in 40 years your net worth would be identical to what it is today, you would probably think I'm crazy. And yet many of you may have seen the article earlier this week. The Federal Reserve released a report saying that the net worth of the average medium American family today stands at where it was in 1992. There has been no measurable gain in 20 years. If in 1998 I told you that in 12 years, 14 years, the federal government would have $1 billion deficits, you'd think I was crazy. If you remember, President Clinton had forecast federal government surpluses well into the first decade of the 21st century. The topic we're dealing with is one where it really is a crystal ball, and I think we need to appreciate how much things can change. The couple areas I'd like to mention, maybe three. One, I think in the years ahead, you're going to be confronting a population with lower incomes. The next generation is not going to have the level of income the previous generation. They will be looking for those $10 bottles of wine, though some studies do suggest millennials are more inclined to pay $50 for a bottle of wine than baby boomers of the generation I'm in. So you're going to find, I think, lower incomes across the board in the United States for a fairly long time. I think there's a lot of money passing hands intergenerationally. Parents are supporting children. Grandparents are supporting grandchildren. There are not going to be pockets of money passing at the end of one's life. So I think across the board, you're going to be dealing with a population that has a more restricted disposable income for a time to come. We had talked about brands this morning. I found it fascinating. I was thinking about brands. Again, I have to come up with a title now. I can't say chief counsel or anything. And so I just put independent professional. I thought of retired senior bureaucrat, but that seemed to be up with what Sasha called equestrian waste manager this morning. So I figured that would definitely not cut it. When his comments were fascinating when you think about diversity. I mean, we are a diverse society becoming more diverse. There are at least 5 states so far that are plurality states on diversity issues. And you have to think about your brands and you have to think about your promotions, how you market to a diverse community, culturally, ethnically, religiously, subculturally. How do you market to that community? It seems to me you have 2 choices. You can find what really is attractive to their culture, social, gender, racial status, or you can try to convince them that your brand should be relevant to them, should be one they are of interest. You really have to take that into account. Sasha talked about the type of person that is interested in a Land Rover, for instance, and that's a limited brand in a number of ways. And do you want to tell everybody they should have that same interest, or do you develop a brand and a marketing program that goes to those consumers to attract them to your product? I remember during a bit of my career, I worked on tequila trade negotiations with the government of Mexico and the Mexican tequila industry. Some of you may know the name tequila is owned by the government of Mexico. The Ministry of Economy, through the Intellectual Property Institute, owns the name, and the industry uses it under government guidelines. I sat in many meetings with government officials from Mexico who did not like the idea that there were chichi margaritas at the chichi restaurants, because I am told that chichi refers to a woman's breast in a derogatory fashion in Mexico. And they were incensed that we were allowing those types of statements on labels, promotions, advertisements, and the like. You really have to know the culture you're dealing with, and diversity issues, diversity of populations, the people you're marketing to. You have to figure out how are you going to address that ever increasing diversity. And this takes us kind of into the next area of what I'll say the international issues of direct shipment. I don't think there's very much international direct shipment right now, but in many ways, you're going to, in the next 15, 20 years, that may well become an important issue. Between India and China, 1/3 of the world consumers live in those 2 countries. Those, as income in the U.S. levels or doesn't rise as high or perhaps decreases, income in those countries is increasing. It's estimated that by 2040, China will have 35% of the world's GDP. It will represent 35%. The U.S. will be down to about 15% of world GDP by then. There are foreign audiences, foreign customers out there that you have to figure out how are you going to address. And that raises, some of the diversity issues. There was an article in Harper's in May which said that in China, for instance, they had, and they didn't give me a time frame, but China had, I think, about $450 million worth of internet sales of wine online. Brazil had 320 million. Russia had 225 million. I think the figures, based on the cases, the 2.9 million cases reported earlier, would be about $1.1 billion in the U.S. Huge market there, a market which is apparently already utilizing direct shipments of wine. And how do you get to those markets? That's where you may want to fall back to support from your government on trade negotiations. We find that if for those of you who get involved in international trade, the World Trade Organization has various trade agreements. One of those agreements has a provision called the National Treatment Provision. The National Treatment Provision essentially is the Interstate Commerce Clause non-discrimination provision. It says you can't treat your domestics more favorably than you treat your trading partners. There are over 160 members of the World Trade Organization right now who subscribe to those agreements. There are about, at any one time, 195, 196 countries in the world, depending on civil wars and the like. But so you have a huge number of countries that have that national treatment obligation. And if they're allowing internet sales in their countries, they're allowing direct shipment sales in their countries, should they be opening those to other markets? So I think you have huge opportunities out there, but there could well be a large number of changes on the horizon. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to come up to the podium because I actually have some slides, which I'm going to have to sprint through, so in the name of succinctness. There's some graphs in here. Just kind of take the graphs as kind of visual snapshots, like a flashcard, and I'll be able to share the actual numbers and details of the presentation later. So don't worry about writing them down, etc. Speaking about the future 20 years out, in my business, we tend to focus on the right now to 2 years out. We analyze consumer trade perceptions of a product or trend or region, or predict the effects of a package or appellation or price change next year, that kind of stuff. So 20 years out should be easier. I mean, if we're still in the same business, it means whatever I said 20 years ago didn't screw things up that much. And if I'm in a different business, no one's going to check what I said 20 years ago. So this is all good. The only issue is, can I figure out how to switch there? All right, there we go. So, undoubtedly, the wine market has come through a remarkable 2 decades of growth, whether you look at it in terms of per capita consumption, which is right here, annual growth, shipments made to the market, et cetera. Here's the population per capita consumption since 1970. Note the steady growth since 1990. Here we are with the percentage change in table wine consumption in the U.S. since 1993, all up, up, up. Varies year by year, but it's continually growing. And here are the table wine shipments since 2001, all happy, happy, happy charts. So it's really very, very impressive, the growth in this industry, and many industries would kill to have this kind of growth overall in terms of the volume and dollars we're shipping. But something to bear in mind is that the market has really deepened much more than it has broadened. If you look at Wine Market Council data since 1994, what it shows is a pattern of some marginal wine drinkers turning into weekly wine drinkers, some low-frequency weekly wine drinkers quite a few of them turning into high-frequency or near-daily consumption, and also the defection of some marginal wine drinkers into very infrequent or non-wine drinkers. So we've really flip-flopped from kind of a 80-20-ish industry in 1994 with a relatively small number of high-frequency drinkers to an industry where if you are drinking wine, you're likely to be drinking wine pretty frequently. And just to further drive this home, this chart is the percentage of wine drinkers represented by various types of various frequencies of wine consumption. The red is the 2010 figures and the pale brown is the 2000 figures. But the main point is to look over at those numbers on the side. We've gone from 29 million core, that is to say, once a week or more often wine consumers in 2000 to 44 million in 2010. Meanwhile, the marginal wine consumers have actually somewhat declined, and there's some various interesting theories as to why that is, but that's for another day. So in order to look forward, I say to myself, well, what factors drove this wine boom? Because then we can ask ourselves, Are they still in place? Is there something that will undo them? So this is my list of kind of the leading suspects: growth in income, marketing investment, media and popular culture, a change in the nature of the product itself, and food culture. So let's start off with growth in income. Is that really the key factor here? And the answer is no, not really. If you compare change in GDP or per capita income to change in wine sales, and I'm talking about volume here, we'll get to dollars, over the long term in a variety of countries, the correlation is very weak, or in fact, in many cases, actually negative. Just for illustrative purposes, here are two charts of GDP in red, growth in red over many years, from 1960 to 2000, and GDP is in blue and wine consumption in red for the US and France. And you can see in France there's actually been a steady decline in wine consumption while a steady increase in GDP. US, there it sort of goes up and down, but certainly no clear relationship there. This one, each dot on this chart represents 1 year from 1991 to 2010. So we have some boom years and we have 3 recessions in there. The vertical axis is the percentage change in per capita income. The horizontal is the percentage change in wine shipments. But don't worry about the actual numbers. Just going to look for a second, ask yourself if you see any clear pattern. And if you said no, you're right. There is minimal correlation between growth or change in income and the change in wine shipments in terms of volume in this country. The little R² formula for the numbers geeks in there shows it's close, the R² is close to 0. It has almost no mathematical correlation between those changes in those two numbers. If we plot change in income versus change in wine spending, you do see some relationship. In this case, I've represented change in spending as the average retail price per case. You see a strong relationship. You got R² of about 0.36. So roughly a third of the change in wine dollars spending is associated with a similar change in income, but that's obviously not the whole story. So we can dissect the Great Recession's impact in more detail another time, but the gist of it is, the main point is that certainly in the case of wine volume and wine sales in terms of number of bottles or liters or whatever, there is very little relationship, and there is some relationship, but it's not utterly determinative, even in the case of spending on wine. All right, how about marketing investment? Well, I don't think so. If you compare us to the beer, spirits, ad world, what we do in the wine business is minimal. And yes, we're strong. We're stronger than we look by advertising metric, because we've got lots of boots in the ground in terms of words of mouth and PR events and wine tourism, very critical, product placement in the media, so on and so forth. Still a big gap, in my opinion. I just don't think that's it. How about popular culture and media? This can have a startling effect. The famous 60-minute red wine broadcast in the early 90s. Nixon goes to China, and then you have a proliferation of Chinese restaurants in the US in the early 70s, and I have a whole theory for another day about how that changed the way we look at food in this country. But the point is that there's something here, I would argue, there's something here that's hard to grasp, but undoubtedly true. Popular culture, via everything from movies to cookbooks to magazines to restaurant promotions, has been steadily beating the drum for a kind of idyllic French-Italian-inspired wine food lifestyle for the last 20 years that appeals very strongly to a large subsegment of this population. And if you think about it, go for contrast, there's no equivalent broad-based romanticizing or merchandising of like British pub culture or German beer garden culture, which, by the way, at the turn of the last century had very serious roots and precedents, as beer gardens were a thing in 1900. They aren't anymore. Chinese tea house culture, Japanese bath culture, Middle Eastern coffee house culture, African dance culture. None of these things have equivalents like this sort of under the Tuscan sun thing that's happening in our popular culture here. So I think this has had a significant effect. What's the life cycle for this kind of cultural idolization? Could very well be decades, but we have to ask ourselves, if we're going to be visionary, what happens if and when pop culture gets bored with this gestalt? And is there another mental space in which wine can play? How about changing the nature of the product? Well, you know, we're so into wine, we regard, you know, changing the barrels from Limousin to Nevers as a really big deal. But when you compare it to other exploding categories of food, I just don't see revolutionary changes of the types you see in categories like cheese or condiment or coffee. I mean, if you compare the before and after in the last 20 years of these products to what's happened in the wine industry, it's just we don't really compare. In fact, I would argue that within the wine category, the flavor range actually narrowed in the late 90s, early 2000s, which was a time of very strong growth. However, flawed wines are much, much less common. And in fact, one of the biggest changes in consumer attitudes in the last 2 decades when I've been doing or purchasing or designing research has been the disappearance of bad wine. What do I mean by that? Well, take a look at this chart. This is from the Wine Opinions Panel. The Wine Opinions Panel is 6,000 consumers that we regularly run tests and surveys on at Wine Opinions. They represent the 20 million high-frequency, high-involvement wine consumer. These people purchase all price levels of wine very frequently, but they are responsible for about 90% plus of the wine sold over $20 in the U.S. Obviously not those 6,000 people, the 20 million they represent. But we asked for quality ratings on 11 super premium brands. These are brands that range from about $12 to $20, generally speaking. And if you look at this, we spent a lot of time talking about quality. Is there a pointer on this thing? There we go. Spent a lot of time talking about quality and sort of arguing about what's going on up here. But what's going on down here in this last column, the poor column, is really very interesting in itself. I mean, 1 to 4% of the sample regarded these brands, all of which are fairly prominent brands, as poor. And even the fair column is pretty low numbers. Really, everyone it's like Lake Wobegon. It's the market where everyone is above average. And what does that mean? What that means is that we've reduced the risk of getting a bad wine. That's changing perceptively and in terms of prestige, but in terms of literally getting something that's flawed and going to irritate someone or think they're bad, in their experience, as they've tried more and more wines, they're finding more and more wines they like. So the real question now, the implication is, first of all, if you're talking about quality, you really pretty much have to be, playing up here if that's your only sales story. If quality is it's all about quality. It's not also about style, region, personality, etc. The second point is that you're going to have to go further than this. You're going to have to match up individual taste and style to the consumer that's your target consumer, or vice versa. So if quality isn't an absolute distinguishing measure, consider flavor style. And I don't think we think about this enough in the wine industry. Okay, this is from a project we did for Missouri wine growers who actually are making some terrific wines there, and they're making them, generally speaking, from hybrids that are relatively unknown, especially outside Missouri, but even within Missouri, relatively unknown grape varieties. And they're making them in a variety of styles. So one of the things we did was we asked people who had recently tried a whole bunch of different varieties from California and from Missouri, and cross-index their reaction to those wines based on what they had stated their preferred wine style. And what you see is, Cabernet, obviously if your preferred wine style is dry red, Cabernet, 3% will say they dislike it. If your preferred wine style is semi-sweet white, it's 22%. Now you may say, well, who cares about what people think about Norton or whatever, but consider you've got Albarino, Godello, Verdelho, Tempranillo, all the way to Zierfandler, and you've got regions from Alicante to Yecla, and that's just in Spain, all competing for people's attention. People are encountering new wines and new varieties all the time, and making sure that they understand through your communications and you figure out what it is they're looking for in terms of taste profile will be critical. Otherwise, large numbers of them are going to taste the wine and say, I don't like that, and write it off. So food culture, that's another possibility, suspect. Reversal, are we going to reverse ourselves from all these wonderful products back to the days of bologna and Wonder Bread? I don't think so. We're not putting that genie back in the bottle. But what if something comes along that can do all the things that wine can do as a product? Well, what can wine do? Let's look at its attributes. Expanding upper tier in prices, that's characteristic of a lot of hot food, beverage product categories these days. Many small energetic producers, yes. SKU and flavor fragmentation, that's very correct, just a characteristic. We've got intensity of flavor, we've got distinct sensory properties, we've got artisanal tradition, agrarian roots, and aspirational upscale kind of positioning. Yeah, craft beer. well, I'll leave the rest of it to the question period, but my last point is that craft beer can do a number of these things as well, and really down the road is, I think we've written them off because of the past history of and structure of the beer industry. Things are changing very rapidly there as well. So with that, sorry to take up so much of your time. This is what I'll be keeping an eye on, and move it to our next speaker.
Okay, thanks. I'll try to move quickly here for you. My assignment, and I had a chuckle as I was flying in from New York. Jeff had given me the assignment based on my 30 years experience in the wine, spirits, and beer industry, predict the fate of the three-tier system 15 years out from now. And I was sitting on the plane and realized I can't even predict whether next weekend I'll be able to drink my normal 30-ounce Pepsi and eat some buttered popcorn in a New York City movie theater. And for those of you that haven't heard about it, it's an actual possibility. But anyway, so I'm going to give it my best. Let me preface by saying that I'm not really here to argue the merits of three-tier system or anything like that. But I will say that when you look back to 1933, the 21st Amendment, I think the three-tier system in many respects has served this industry well from the standpoint of trying to make sure it covered the specific guidelines of the 21st Amendment. And if you think of those requirements, what the 21st Amendment was trying to do was protect the public, labeling and marketing and all that, collect taxes, and keep organized crime away. And I think if you look back, I think it's done a great job of that. Those of you that have had a chance to read Daniel Okrant's book, Last Call, or you watch the HBO series Boardwalk Empire, you realize what chaos went on during that time and why some of these rules were written the way they were. But now when you look over the 64 years from 93 to 1997, the beverage alcohol industry operated in what I would define as a tightly defined and fairly consistent three-tier manner. But for the last 15 years, we've experienced what I would call, and again, just my interpretation, one man's opinion, but a bit of a beverage alcohol industrial revolution. And what happened over the last 15 years? Tremendous wholesaler consolidation, right? We're up to 64% of the wine and spirits business is now being done by 10 distributor networks in the U.S. Tremendous importer and U.S. supplier consolidation over the last 15 years. Proliferation of brands, emergence of big box retailers, consistent wine and spirits growth, import growth, internet, advent of the internet, federal excise taxes frozen for most categories for almost 20 years now. No FET increases in key categories for 20 years. You have the Granholm case, direct-to-consumer wine shipping, California-based wine fulfillment operations, compliance software companies, nationally licensed service providers like ourselves, MHW, assisting in market entry for imports and domestic products, flavor craze, growth of the private label brands, celebrity brands, beer wholesalers now entering the wine and spirits business, new distribution outlets, third-party marketing companies, flash wine websites, social media, and most recently, Washington State privatization. So as I try to predict the future 15 years out from now, what I wanted to do was really look at maybe from 30,000 feet, because there's so much complexity out there, but in terms of just probability analysis, what's likely to occur? And I do get asked this question by many, we work with players from 60 countries besides the United States, and they often ask, what about your system and what might we see? So from an analytical and probability analysis, I'll just give you some of the highlights of the review we do and did. Odds of a significant change to the 21st Amendment, I have it at about, and again, this is one man's view, at about 20%. Odds of a bill like H.R. 1161 and the one after it that might interfere with state rights, I give that maybe 20%. Odds that federal and state officials will view beverage alcohol as any other consumer product, 10%. Odds that the federal and state governments will significantly change the tax collection system and processes. Now remember, federal excise tax represent about $10 billion, and state taxes somewhere probably between 5 and 7. I give that about 20%. Odds that the majority of control states will privatize, and if they do privatize, that they'll abolish any form of a three-tier system. I only give that 30%. Doesn't really affect many of the wine players in this room, more the spirits. Odds of a reduction in social concern by the general public and government officials over beverage alcohol use, including concern for 21s, under 21s, DWI, give that about 20%. Odds that beverage alcohol consumption issues facing other countries won't catch the attention of the United States. We're talking about England, Russia, Scandinavia. There's some major social issues and rewriting of laws going on there because of the problems in productivity and under 21s. We're starting to read more and more about that. So all of these things would say, well, regulatory matters are going to be looked at, I think, closely, but also I wouldn't expect anything dramatic. On the other side, if I look at the next 15 years, what are the odds that the federal government and states will look for ways to reduce their operating costs, gain efficiencies, and better understand the marketplace needs? I'd say that's 80% or greater. It's happening already. Odds that federal and states will ask the trade for input. Matt Botting's here. They're doing it. California's doing it. New York is doing it. The TTB is working as closely as ever with trade in all my 30 years. Same thing as I said, California, New York, states are very, very active. Odds that states will work together to help streamline processes and educate each other on regulatory approaches. To me, that's greater than 50%. Odds that wine and spirits will grow at no less than 2 to 3% over the next 15 years. I have that at 60+%. That'll happen. Odds that foreign suppliers will continue to see the U.S. as the primary investment vehicle as they look around the world and want to introduce products. I'd have that at 70%, with the wild card really being China. But even China, I think, is a little early, and I think they've got a lot of kinks to work out in the next 5 years or so. Odds that beer wholesalers will continue the trends they started in the last 3 years, adding wine and spirits. I have that at greater than 75%. A bigger one here, odds that other distribution players will see beverage alcohol as a big opportunity. We've seen all the numbers. Why wouldn't they look? Who am I talking about? The soft drink companies that have tremendous distribution systems in major markets, water companies in the food industry. I see that well over 50%, that many of them will look to jump in as the growth continues. I happen to know that because we've actually had discussions with a number of them. Odds that micro-distilled spirits and craft beers will receive some form of direct-to-consumer shipping benefits. I have that at above 50% as well over the next 15 years. And odds that imported wines will be treated consistent with domestic wineries when it comes to direct shipping. I think that's a definite. It's got to happen. And in that case, obviously, the importer would be serving as the, in effect, the direct shipper, replacing, in theory, what a winery does for domestic wines. So what I see in the next 15 years is what I define or call the evolving flexible three-tier system. And I think it bodes extremely well for everyone in this room. I think the last 15 years have been amazing, and with the amount of purchasing activity at the consumer level that's going to go on in the next 15 years, our market, and that's the beautiful thing about America, the marketplace dictates, and within the rules and regulations that are required, and again, I don't stand up here and say that the three-tier system is not necessary. In many cases, I think it brings a certain order and structure, but there are so many opportunities to work within that system in a modified and a flexible system that is evolving. So again, I went through this very, very quickly, but just to give you a little bit of idea, I don't think there'll be anything earth-shattering that's going to change other than more opportunities for distribution, more outlets for distribution, and probably more creativity as we move down the pike. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. We ran a little bit over. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna adjust the schedule. I still want to give you guys time to ask some questions of our panelists, and I still want to make sure that you get a break. So we're gonna start the next section. We're gonna start the breakout sessions. Instead of at 3:05, it's gonna be at 3:15. And right now, I'd love to take a few questions, if anybody has any questions for our panelists. Brian, Emily's got a mic. Can you wait for it?
What does the shipping landscape look like for beer and spirits right now? Direct to consumer.
direct-to-consumer shipping of wine and spirits. Steve could help me with this one, but they're, generally speaking, all of the state laws specify that only wineries can get permits. There are a few states that allow for the shipping of beer and spirits. I think New Hampshire might be one of them.
Virginia allows beer and wine. Both. New Hampshire used to allow wine, beer, and spirits, and currently they went back to just wine. So right now, beer into Virginia is the only one I'm aware of.
Yeah, there's a few exceptions, Brian, but for the most part, every state law stipulates that only wine can be shipped.
But I would just, I don't know if this is on.
Please, go John.
I would just mention, though, that it only makes sense that the beer industry is looking hard at it right now because they certainly feel they deserve the same opportunity that wine has. And so, as I mentioned before, in the next 15 years, I think you've seen the proliferation of craft beers on restaurant menus all over the country, and the consumers are going to want to look across states and to get their hands on some of that product. And they'll have the same issues that the wine industry faced and effectively defeated over the last 10 or 15 years, where you were able to get yourselves in a position to ship wine directly to consumers. So I think that'll happen. Distilled spirits is going to be a little bit tougher, but one would argue that with the explosion, if you will, we'll call it that, of micro distilleries that are coming up in every state right now, they would argue that they should have the same opportunity as well to send some of their spirits into the consumers in other places.
John, you mentioned that that you didn't expect the majority of the 19 controlled jurisdictions to privatize over the next 15 years. Do you think that some of them will follow Washington's lead?
Well, I think the first big test is coming now in Pennsylvania. I understand that they moved the vote. They were supposed to be voting this week, and I think they've moved that to next week. And I spoke to someone yesterday that usually is reliable, said that they were running after more votes, that they didn't have what they needed. But again, as I mentioned there, it wasn't that they would privatize, but also that they would effectively eliminate a three-tier type approach. I think it's the combination that I was really addressing.
Please. Can you wait for the mic? It's right here.
As a third-party marketer company, do you see any major changes, both positive or negative, that would be affecting us in working with wineries and helping them market and bring their brands to market through our channels?
Well, I think as people get educated and familiar with what these marketing companies are doing and the value that they bring, I think opportunities are going to pick up. And I think a lot of the states, as they start to look over what's going on around them, again, it'll get educated on the benefits that the third-party marketers bring. Because I think in this age of technology and the way what we've seen in the last 15 years with the advent of internet, Facebook, Twitter, and all of that, I think these third-party marketing companies are very, very crucial, I think, to these industries, when I say the wine, spirits, and beer, realizing their maximum potential. The same way other industries operate with marketing companies as well.
We've got, in the regulatory panel, coming up next, Matt Botting from California ABC is going to be speaking. And I think that, they really did a good job last year of reaching out to industry and forming a working group and really talking through these issues. And I think that actually provided a really good framework that can be taken to other states. And so I would anticipate that other states would go through a similar process and follow California's lead in taking a closer look at this issue.
What do you guys think about Canada? Do you guys think it's so tough to get into Canada and the shipping wise over there? Do you guys think Canada is going to open up more to allow more shipments in there? I keep hearing a lot of laws being changed over there right now, but what do you guys think about Canada?
For the moment right now, there is legislation that's almost passed in Canada that would allow shipments between the provinces, very similar to what we're doing between the states. There is a lack of clarity as to whether the individual provinces are going to interpret it the same way that the sponsors of the bill interpreted it. So I think there is a chance there's going to be more shipping intra-Canada. Right now, none of the proposed rules change the rules going into Canada. And I would remind you that our rules are equally prohibitive for them shipping into the United States. So, you know, if anything, I think it would right now be shipments that American wineries have shipped, provided product to the control systems in the various provinces. Your products could be shipped from, you know, if you're only available in British Columbia, people in the other provinces could buy it from the retail structure in British Columbia, but they're not going to be able to buy it direct from the winery here to a great degree right now under those rules without going through all the customs hurdles and everything right now that are so difficult.
I'd add, you also have the cellared in Canada factor too, wherein bulk wine can be sold in Canada and then bottled by Canadian producers, and I'm assuming those wines will be able to cross state
they will.
province lines too.
Yeah.
Jeff?
Rob, please.
Just, one additional comment on that. Over the years, we experienced in the government that the federal government of Canada does have a lot of challenges in trying to get the provincial governments to make certain changes in trade areas. In the early 90s, there were 2 cases under the GATT, the General Agreement of Tariff and Trade. We call them Beer 1 and Beer 2. Essentially, the United States, well, Canada complained against the United States on some things with the wholesale distribution system, some of our distribution systems that they felt did not favor, discriminated against Canadians. The United States, in turn, filed a countersuit, if you will, at the under the GATT, again, the trade organization, contending that some of the provincial systems also discriminated against U.S. products. The panel, which is the adjudicatory body under the GATT, agreed with both countries, said, yes, Canada, you're right, the U.S. discriminates, and U.S., yes, you're right, Canada discriminates. That report has never been implemented because both governments realized they do not have a lot of authority over the states and over the provinces that they would like. So each side is holding the other at bay. So those questions do come up about cross-border trade, but the federal government in both countries realize that when you're dealing with alcohol, the states do have a fair amount of power, and that when you're dealing with the provinces, again, the provinces have a fair amount of power. So it's a difficult trade issue for both governments.
I have a question for Rowan, and I was wondering if you could just tell us a little bit about shipping in Europe or within the UK and what that process is like from a producer standpoint and how the consumer sees it, and if you see any similarities or ways the U.S. could take from that, or vice similarities, differences?
It's mainly differences, to be honest. In the UK, for example, there are no restrictions. We deliver overnight over the whole of the UK. You don't need a signature. If the customer isn't there, you can leave it on the doorstep, leave it with a neighbor. So the whole process costs about 1/3 of what it costs in America after adjusting for distance. And as a result, home shipments are much, it's a much bigger slice of the market.
Right behind you.
Hey there. Yes, this question is for Rowan. First, you had mentioned early on that wine in the U.S. is priced like a luxury, and I think probably because our culture hasn't been brought up drinking wine, and I think alluding to other things you said, as it becomes more accessible, I think the price will come down. But I'm just curious if you could elaborate just a touch on the 3-to-1 versus 10-to-1 pricing and how you came up with this, and if that also includes your wines and, you know, versus wines grown in Napa Valley, and the cost of land for the most part is not going to go down. So if you could just touch upon that briefly.
So I think the average price of Napa Valley Cab in DTC is $62, right? Let's assume that the average bulk price for Napa Cabernet in the open market is, let's say, $6,000 a ton. That means there's about $7 worth of grapes in that $62 bottle of wine. So it's a ratio of about 10-to-1. In Europe, if you exclude the absolute top end Bordeaux, Burgundies, which constitute, 1 and a bit % of the market, so small you can barely measure it. If you exclude that, the similar ratio is about 3-to-1. So American consumers are paying a great deal more for their product than consumers in the rest of the world. And the definition of a luxury good is that the price the consumer pays has nothing to do with the cost of production. With fast-moving consumer goods, the price eventually goes towards the cost of production because someone will always undercut someone who tries to do it another way. One of the big differences in Europe is that the wine supply is completely dominated by supermarkets. In the UK, 76% of all wine is sold by supermarkets, and 70-something% of that is on special offers, sales, discounts, and all the rest. So the supermarkets have been absolutely rigorous in going to their producers, working out their production efficiencies, and telling the producers what they're going to pay. And in the US, the supermarket dominance is not nearly as strong, and therefore it's a much more supplier-driven market. Now, as the business grows, as whether it gets deregulated or not, I think the economics are such that it's unlikely that if people are drinking, $60 Napa cabs, and they're drinking $10 Argentinian Malbecs and saying, well, you know what, there's not 6 times worth the value in this, eventually consumers will gravitate towards where the price-quality ratio is tightest. It's happened in most of the rest of the world, and in that sense, the US is an anomaly.
One last question. Right here. Mike's coming.
So it seems like an interesting perfect storm happening here, right? Because you've got a younger demographic making less money, but the reality is that they're spending 5x, 10x percentages greater on luxury goods than their baby boomer grandparents or parents did, right? Prices are going down. You really start to deal with the cost of fulfillment, right? So you're saying it's a third the cost to do in England. We have lots of challenges here on that. What's the answer?
ShipCompliant.
That would fall into the cost side.
Oh,
right.
I just wanted to get invited back next year, so stop me after 7.
The reason we called naked is the idea is what you see is what you get. And I think that what's going to happen in this market is that people will get what they pay for. And at the moment you have the appearance of that, and people like to believe that, but it's not strictly true. I think that is what will happen. So when you talk about a perfect storm, I believe prices will fall sharply, but I also think volumes will explode. When you take a luxury good and put it in the reach of people's ability to consume every day like a foodstuff, there's a huge amount of space available in this market for demand to grow. And by the way, we're recruiting, so.
If I could just add one thing, because I actually, my opinion is much different than Rowan. I don't see it that way at all. I see, you look at, for example, take most recently the beer industry right now, their growth, the beer industry, which is significantly bigger than wine and spirits, their growth is all coming from the smaller players in the craft side that are selling beer today anywhere in a restaurant anywhere from $8 to $15 a bottle, and no end in sight on some of that. I look back at the structure, and again, looking at England and some of the countries over there, part of our system, those suppliers that send wine into those chains, they work on pennies. I understand that. And that's part of the reason why they're so focused in coming to America, is because the margins across the 3-tier system are much healthier and